So great. So, and I'm very relaxed, guys. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please do let me know. You can either put a question in the chat box. As I said, it's slightly difficult on Teams to monitor the chat box, so you can always shout out, but I'll try and monitor the chat on my phone, but can't guarantee that that always works. So what is the cost of MedED studies? So climate change has been posed as the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And the healthcare industry itself is actually responsible for about 45% of global emissions. And that's comparable to the aviation or shipping industry. We often hear about how bad flying or shipping is for the planet, but we never really talk about how bad the health industry is. And we actually emit about the same amount as aviation. I think I'm a little... So hopefully I'm not echoing. And currently there's no real central strategy on how climate change and sustainability are taught at med schools in the UK. There's a few learning outcomes that we'll go through later, but there's no specific strategy from the GMC or anything like that as to how climate change should be taught or what topics should be taught. And there's no significant reviews in the literature about climate change and sustainability in medical school teaching in the UK. This year we had the Planetary Health Report Card come out, which is the closest thing we've had to that. And this is slightly different on a number of levels, but I'd encourage you all to look up Planetary Health Report Card. Some of you may well have already been involved in it. It's a fantastic initiative. Okay, so what's the purpose of this study? So the purpose is that we're going to be looking at these sustainable healthcare learning outcomes that the GMC came up, sort of adopted a few years ago, and they were published in the Lancet. And there's three sort of broad brush learning outcomes with 13 sort of sub learning outcomes below them. So the number one is describe how the environment and human health interact at different levels. So that's generally the concept of climate change and the environment and its effect on health as sort of a risk factor or to health. And then the second learning outcome is more about how we can improve sustainability of healthcare systems. So what do doctors need to know to improve sustainability of health systems, and then the third one is more sort of an ethical learning outcome. So discuss how the duty of a doctor is to promote health and protect the environment, basically. And we'll be talking about these three learning outcomes and the learning outcomes under these in due course, and that'll be part of the crash course. So what's the purpose of this study? Why are we doing it? So we want to really assess the extent and nature of teaching climate change and sustainability topics in the curricula of UK medical schools. So we want to do this to basically understand where we are at the moment. Are we what are we teaching? Are we teaching enough? What topics are we teaching, and do those relate to the risks and the most salient issues at the time? We wanted to perhaps create a tool that might be able to evaluate our progress. So secondary objectives would be to sort of establish a method to assess our future progress in the UK, and to set a baseline. So where are we now to measure that future progress against? And we also want to sort of identify where med schools are doing really well. So we want to bring out examples and case studies of good practice. So if your med school comes out really well, we might ask you for a bit of information to us how they might have come to do that. And we also want to, with any good audit, you have an implementation stage at the end where you try and improve things. And so as part of this study, we want to present data back to individual medical schools, so identifying where there are perhaps gaps in the coverage of climate change and sustainability teaching in their curriculum. And so what's the kind of study plan? So we're planning on getting all UK medical schools audited as part of this study. We've got, I think, about 85% of medical schools now have got auditors. And almost all of the major ones. We're going to have 2 auditors from each medical school, and so that's you guys. So thanks very much again for signing up. And you guys are going to, hopefully you can all hear me actually. It'd be good just to get a little thumbs up, just to show that I'm not just talking to no one. I don't know if anyone could just write in the chat, but it's still going. I'm still all good. Thanks very much. It's always slightly concerning when you're just talking to a laptop screen in a sort of dingy room in a hospital. Anyway, so 2 auditors from each medical school. So that's you guys, and you guys will request learning materials from both graduate and undergraduate courses if you have those at your medical school, and that's really like the Blackboard access, or whatever your equivalent to Blackboard is, maybe Moodle access to all your teaching materials for all the years of your medical school. And you guys are going to independently audit your medical school's curriculum using these GMC learning outcomes as a gold standard. So it's really the case of going through the lectures from year 1 through to year 5 and seeing if the learning outcomes are being met and how. And so we're asking that you guys will complete this data collection by the 1st of August. After that, we're going to have a look at the 2 data sets from the 2 different auditors and just make sure that they're similar enough. And if they are, we'll ask you guys to then just work together to create for us to then analyse. And then we'll be sending out sort of a post-audit analysis survey for you guys, just to really understand what you guys thought of the learning outcomes and how clear they were, and if it was a bit of a struggle to really understand what they're trying to get at. And we'll be doing the analysis and final write-up sort of over the summer or sort of autumn, and with the aim of publication in sort of late October, for which you'll all get collaborator status. So, hopefully that's clear. We'll talk, so as I said, we'll talk, give you guys a crash course in climate change and sustainability and its relevance to medicine, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll talk about how to fill in the data template. And hopefully, and I want this to be as interactive as possible through Teams. It's always pretty difficult, but if you have any questions, feel free to shout out while I'm talking, or just pop something on the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it. So basically, this crash course talks through these 13 learning outcomes that you guys are going to be assessing your curriculum against. So, number 1, so this is the first broad learning outcome, how the environment and human health interact at different levels. So this is, as I said at the beginning, looking at sort of how the environment is sort of a risk factor to certain human diseases, and also how humans have perhaps an impact on the environment. And this is broken down into 4 sub-learning outcomes, and we've numbered these, but if you look at the publication, then the publication in the Lancet, they're not actually numbered, but we've just numbered them for ease. All right. So, and I'll talk through each one of these in detail as we go along. So this is 1A, talks about outlining the dependence of human health on global and ecological systems. And this is the sort of concept that human health is reliant on some basic environmental things, both at a local level. So that could be sort of air quality in your city or town, or your water quality, or perhaps your land quality even. And so that's at your local level, but also the dependence on human health of sort of the global ecosystem level. And that's really talking about how human health is dependent on a stable climate, how we're reliant on biodiversity for a huge amount of our food and actually our medicine production, and how natural resources and the depletion of and thereof can actually affect our ability to provide healthcare. So the idea of this is if anyone in your lectures are talking about how climate change affects health or biodiversity can affect health, that's really, they're covering that aspect of this learning outcome. So it goes beyond just sort of normal biopsychosocial model, and really is talking about biopsychosocial environmental model, and if the ecosystem model. And if your lecturers are talking about that, then they're probably covering this learning outcome. And then another concept, an interesting concept, is this idea of the exposome in the sort of 1990s and noughties, we have the we're talking about the genome and how everyone's genes are different, or how we can look at DNA to predict disease. There's now a lot of science going into the exposome, so every individual has a very individual toxic exposure. And that can actually have an impact on health, and it can have a specific impact on health. So there's a lot of work being done on understanding how specific exposomes, or your exposures through your life, can impact your health later on. So that's sort of 1A, looking at just the more generic sort of air, water, land, and how that's and stable climate, and how that's important for sort of global health. 1B is talking about the contribution of human activity to sort of global environmental changes. And this isn't necessarily to do with health, but this is like really getting at the idea that, is your medical school talking to you about like anthropomorphic climate change? Anthropogenic, sorry. And so are they talking about the hockey stick graph? And this is the sort of famous hockey stick graph that came out in the sort of well, this is an iteration of that graph that came out in I think in 1999, and it really associated global temperatures, which you can see is the black dot, with greenhouse gases produced. So in sort of the Industrial Revolution, we had a big increase in greenhouse gas production, and as a result, we're seeing global temperatures rise. Is your medical school just teaching this basic sort of concept about climate change, and are they teaching it about biodiversity and how human activity, so monoculture, so for instance palm oil monoculturing, how that can affect our ability to how biodiversity, how humans are affecting biodiversity loss, and how that's an impact on health. And then the other sort of aspect is how we contributing to resource depletion. Are we living within our means, and is your university talking to you about how much we're overshooting our planet's resources? And so this learning outcome is really looking at the sort of human activity and contributing to environmental changes. So 1C, if there are any questions, again, please just shout out. 1C is like a really big learning outcome as such. It's one of the more important ones, and one of the ones that you probably get taught about most in med school. If anything, this is the most likely one to come up. And we're going to break this down into 2 different aspects. So describe the mechanisms by which human health is affected by environmental change. And there's 2 aspects to this, and there's sort of the mechanisms. So if we look at this really neat little diagram from the CDC, you can see this sort of inner wheel here. We could think about as mechanisms of how human health is affected by climate change or environmental degradation. So climate change is going to bring about severe weather, air pollution as a result of, you can have increased air pollution as a result of climate change, changes in vector ecology, and other things. And these are all mechanisms, and these themselves don't obviously affect human health, but they knock on and have these effects on human health. So extreme heat can cause heat-related illness and death, or air pollution can lead to asthma exacerbations or increased stroke incidence. And this is going to be a big one at your med school, and we really want to delineate here what your med school is teaching about, because at the end of this we want to look at what are the med schools teaching about, because we expect that maybe they're teaching about air pollution a lot, but maybe not so much extreme heat. And whether that's proportionate to the amount of disease, mortality and morbidity associated with those mechanisms. And then once you think about the mechanisms, I want you guys to delineate what human health impacts that your university is actually talking about as a result of these mechanisms. So are they talking about increased allergens as a result of ragweed, for instance, in Europe? And are they talking about how that affects health? So are they talking about allergies or asthma or respiratory illness? So that's really thinking about risk factors of climate changes on human health. The next one, as part of this, the final one, as part of this cluster of learning outcomes, is describe features of health promoting local environment and community and healthcare settings. And this is really talking about the idea of co-benefits. So a co-benefit being an intervention that not only improves health, but can improve the environment, or vice versa. So are your med school teaching you about the idea of co-benefits and how things like, for instance, active infrastructure, so implementing cycle lanes in cities, can have both a positive impact on the population's health because people are cycling more, their cardiovascular health is going to be better, their mental health is going to be better, but also it's going to reduce levels of pollution because you're going to get less traffic. Other examples of co-benefits might be building an urban park. You get increased tree density in the urban area, which reduces pollution and also reduces emissions in general. And also then you get a place where people can socialise, improving mental health, but also exercise. Is your university teaching you about this specific concept of these co-benefits? So how promoting local healthy things can promote the environment as well? So that's sort of those are the learning outcomes that go under 1A, which is really, again, looking at how the environment affects health. Moving on to sort of the learning outcome 2, as we call it. So this is improving the environmental sustainability of health systems. So we're moving away from climate being an impact on health and moving towards how creating a sustainable healthcare system is important and how to do that. And these are the sort of 5 learning outcomes that sit under that. And we'll go through each one of these in a second. So the first sort of learning outcome under this is define the concept of environmental sustainability. And this is a pretty simple one to cover, but are your medical schools teaching about what environmental sustainability actually means? So the idea that we can sustain life on Earth as to what within our own within our own remit of the planet. At the moment, we're not currently doing that, as you can see from this graphic. Our personal overshoot day is 17th of July. Oh, so this is one of the other members of the team went on footprint calculator, and you can calculate where your overshoot day is depending on where your environment and depending on what your environmental footprint is. This individual, Ben, who's part of the research team, found out that he overshoots on the 17th of July, so he's not currently living an environmentally sustainable way of life, almost impossible to do. But is your medical school teaching you about the definition of environmental sustainability? And if so, then they take this learning outcome. 2B is really talking about more sort of demographic trends and how trends in the learning outcome is how trends in demographics, technology, and climate and resource availability might affect our ability to provide healthcare in the future. And this is really talking about healthcare resilience and vulnerability. Is our healthcare system are we able to cope with the challenges ahead? And what are the challenges? So some of you might have been in hospitals working on your placements last August. That's when I started as a doctor, and it was unbelievably hot. Southampton Hospital's not equipped with air conditioning, and we had a lot of patients get really sick. We had a lot of kidney injuries, we had a lot of delirium, and we also see a lot of death when heat waves happen. And is our healthcare, our hospitals equipped to deal with these challenges that climate change poses? And are we equipped to deal with a growing world population? Not specifically climate related, this one, but it's more demographic focused, and I guess you could argue sustainability rather than climate related. Are we prepared to, or is our healthcare system prepared for a growing population globally? And are we also learning about how resource depletion may affect our ability to provide healthcare. So some of you might know that the world's helium supply might be running out soon. I think the US has 95% of the world's helium or something like that. And helium is actually really important. We use it in MRI scanners. So are they teaching you that resource depletion may affect our ability in years to come to provide healthcare? And then 2C is really looking at the environmental impact resulting from healthcare provision. So this is the idea of basically presenting you guys with the carbon footprinting of the NHS, and the data is out there, and we know where the impacts come from. Some of you may have seen the NHS net zero strategy that came out a few months ago, that gives very accurate carbon footprinting to the NHS's emissions. So delineates where exactly the emissions are coming from. So you can see here, building energy, this is a bit old actually, but building energy use is 17%, whereas procurement, so buying pharmaceuticals predominantly, and equipment and other things, actually has a massive impact on the carbon footprint of the NHS. We can see that here. So this is, I don't usually like 3D graphs, but this one depicts a pretty shocking picture. And so the bars show the tons of carbon dioxide emitted per like category of emissions, or area of emissions within the health sector. And you can see by far and away the largest emissions come from primary care. So that's the prescription of pharmaceuticals. So the supply chain of our medications that we're giving out actually have by far the largest sort of individual impact. And is your medical school teaching about this? This is really important stuff to know. Many of you may become GPs, or at least many people at medical school will become GPs. And if they don't know this, then they don't know that prescribing medications isn't just, if the patient's not taking them, it's not just like a harmless or just a cost, it's not just a cost loss to the NHS, but actually has a massive impact on the planet. And we need to be thinking about what medications we want to prescribe based perhaps on their environmental footprint. Perhaps therein lies a bit of an ethical debate that we'll talk about later. But is your medical school even broaching the topic of this? And 2D, so that's 2C, so what is sort of where the impacts are rising, and 2D is your medical school telling you about ways in which we might be able to improve the sustainability of our healthcare systems. So this could be in individual practice. So for instance, talking about changing inhalers from powdered dose, from metered dose inhalers, so your sort of standard salbutamol spray inhaler, to a powdered dose inhaler, which has a much smaller impact. Are they telling you about things like co-benefits, or building parks and things like that that can improve or increase? Sorry, not building parks, building gardens in the hospitals that can improve biodiversity, but also improve recovery. Things like that. Are they telling you ways in which our health system could be more sustainable? Things like using hybrid equipment in surgery rather than just all disposable. If they're telling you about that kind of stuff, then 2D is probably being ticked. And this is just a schematic of how the NHS could potentially become net zero. This is an old graphic, but I'll let you guys look at this in due course. And these are all the ways in which the NHS could reduce its emissions. These are the emissions on the left-hand side, and these are ways in which we could reduce. There's sort of all different categories. And I'd encourage you guys to have a look at that in your own time. Go on the NHS Net Zero report, and you'll see where they're planning on reducing their impact. But is your medical school showing you graphs like this, where and talking them through to show where we can make easy gains? Things like reducing anaesthetic gas emissions, often a very easy gain, quick win. But are we doing it? We need to be teaching medical students about this so they can reduce it in their practice when they become anaesthetists or consultants. So that's 2D, and 2E is quite similar to 1D. It's more of sort of a policy level initiative or policy level. Learning outcomes, so synergies between policies and practices that promote environmental sustainability and those that promote health. So this is, again, looking at the idea of co-benefits, but more on sort of a national scale, on a wider scale. And this is a nice little infographic from the BMJ that shows health benefits of certain interventions with the environmental benefits there as well. So you can see phasing out coal could prevent a lot of deaths, a lot of morbidity and mortality, but also has the environmental benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Are they talking to you about these sort of policy level interventions that might be able to promote both health and sustainability? And often if this is covered, probably 1D is covered as well. Don't worry too much about discerning the difference between them. And another example of that could be sort of a policy that's increasing the knowledge about social prescribing, or making it more common. So our doctors prescribing sort of cycling to work, or which can both have environmental benefits, and a doctor could say prescribe a bicycle, and that could improve a patient's mental health, their cardiovascular, have beneficial impacts on the environment. And is this becoming practice generally? Do we have the policies there to support that? And then learning outcome 3. So that learning outcome 2 is about how we can become sort of more sustainable as doctors, and learning outcome 3 is how the duty of a doctor how the duty of a doctor to protect and promote health is shaped by the dependence of human health on the local and global environment. So this is more about talking about the duty of a doctor, and a bit more about like the sort of more ethical sides of it. And it's got 4 learning outcomes under it, which we'll talk through in a second. So the first one is how the health impacts of environmental change are distributed unequally within populations. And this is a major aspect of climate change teaching, especially in health, is most of the emissions or most of the health impacts are felt by countries that actually aren't emitting very much, and the richest populations are getting away a bit easier. So you can see the richest 10% of population of countries or population produce 50% of the world's emissions, whereas predominantly climate change, climate events or extreme weather events happen in areas which are poorer. So you can see here, this is a little map showing where extreme weather has occurred in the sort of around about the last 20 years, and you can see that Central America, parts of which are very poor, have been affected. Southeast Asia, again, very poor. Areas which aren't responsible for emissions are actually feeling the brunt of that, and there's an unequal distribution of climate events. Is your medical school talking to you about this sort of ethical problem that we're seeing? The sort of 2B is an interesting learning outcome. So it's sort of recognise and articulate personal values concerning environmental sustainability. So is your med school telling you about different organisations that exist and perhaps where to align yourself, or if you align yourself to any? Are you perhaps the more extreme end with Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace, or maybe a sort of more measured with the sort of associating yourself with places like Centre for Sustainable Healthcare? Are they just telling you about these sort of organisations or places in which you can sort of talk about your or understand your own personal beliefs, and can you articulate that to maybe a patient or a colleague? So are they encouraging you to have those conversations and think perhaps introspectively about where you sit on this spectrum? Learning outcome 3C is talking about sort of the ethical tensions between allocating resources to individual patients and protecting the environment. So this is an example I used earlier, which is which I'll talk about in a second. But the idea about this learning outcome is: are we thinking about environmental ethics? So some medications are are very damaging to the environment. And should we be considering that when we prescribe them? Should we perhaps not be prescribing medications that are really bad for the environment and prescribing things that are slightly better, even if we know that patient might not get as good an outcome? So an example here is if if an asthmatic patient is on a metered dose inhaler, so it's a standard salbutamol kind of inhaler, and their asthma is well controlled, is it ethically responsible to change them to a powdered dose inhaler that's got 18 times less carbon footprint? You stand the risk of them getting worse asthma, but you're also benefiting the environment. And as it shows here, 3.5% of the NHS's emissions actually come from metered dose inhalers. So should we be changing all our asthmatics over to powdered dose because it's better for the environment? It can be a difficult call. But is your university even talking about this ethical tension? It's not something that I'd necessarily thought about before going into all of this. And 3D is your university talking about sort of organisational sustainability policies and legal frameworks? So have they taught you about NHS Net Zero, which is the sustainability policy or strategy for the NHS? And are they talking to you about just in general the legal framework around emissions and our reduction targets and whether they're legally binding? And are they talking to you about how our emissions arise and how we're meeting our targets and the sort of intricacies around that? So this chart on the bottom right shows a nice little depiction of where we are in the UK in terms of our emissions and in terms of our emissions reductions. So the green and black is usually what the government records, which is CO2 emitted from our shores, essentially. So from goods and services consumed by UK residents, produced in the UK, and CO2 generated by our households. You can see here that the government would say our emissions have reduced significantly from 1997 to 2017. But if you take out from that the CO2 that we're emitting from other countries, say we're importing a lot more and therefore we're outsourcing our manufacturing process and outsourcing our CO2, you can actually see our emissions have remained pretty stagnant throughout the last 20 years or so. And is your university perhaps talking to you about these sort of intricacies where in UK emissions or global emissions, or just talking to you about this at all? So that was our kind of crash course in climate change and health. It's a real crash course. I usually give sort of a few lectures on this topic, and I'm sorry I haven't covered it all in completely perfect detail, but it's just to give you guys an idea of what these learning outcomes are really getting at, just so you understand what to look for in your lectures when they come up. So I'm just going to pause things there for 5 minutes and give you guys a break, and we'll go into the data collection template in just a second. But I'm just going to grab a glass of water. But if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to pop it on the chat and I will answer it when I am back in 2 seconds. Okay, no questions it seems. I'll give you guys, so we'll reconvene back in like a couple minutes, let you guys get up, have a glass of water or whatever. So it's just at 7:45, we'll just join back. Okay, so hopefully you're back and I haven't scared too many of you off. We're going to leave the PowerPoint presentation now. I'm going to talk you guys through the data templates, the data collection template that you guys will be using while you audit your medical course. So I've just popped in the chat a little box link, so you should be able to click on that. And if you go onto that box site and open the file that says data collection template empty or something like that, if you go and open that, then we can go through this next part of this talk. So if you could just let me know if that's all working and you've managed to get that, that'd be really, really helpful. And this should be basically the same template that you got sent out by well, it would have been by Rachel, but it might have had my name on it maybe a couple of weeks ago, or a week or so ago. So if you could just give me just tell me that at least someone's got it to work, that'd be super grateful. Yeah, link is working. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, fine. So, and can you all see my screen? I've just changed from the PowerPoint to the Excel, so hopefully you can see my screen here. Great, thanks guys, really appreciate the feedback, that's helpful. So this is the data collection template that you guys can be using, and hopefully it's fairly user friendly, but please, if you have any questions as we go through this, do let me know. We're going to go through an example lecture, and then I'm going to get you guys to go away and do a little test yourself, and then we can go through the answers. So this is the collection template, and the idea is that you each time a learning outcome is covered in a lecture or anything like that, you put a new row in the template, and you put your university in here. So let's call it Southampton, because I'm biased. We could go title of teaching session, climate change crash course. For instance, we could say that this was the year, and you go, which courses is part of it? Is it graduate or undergraduate? We could say, let's say undergraduate, year of study, so you could say year 4, and teaching session type. So is it lecture, seminar? Let's call it lecture. Is it problem-based learning or peer-to-peer teaching? And then I want you guys to put in the session length. So if it's an hour long, then that's that. And we'll come back to the percentage, and then the percentage of teaching session on this is an estimate, basically. So this is so for each, we're going to do it by slide. So if a learning outcome is covered by in a slide, we're going to say, well, take that slide as a percentage of the total of that teaching session. So if it was, say, a 56 slide lecture and it had one slide on it covering learning outcome, then it'd be the other way around, wouldn't it? 1 divided by 56, and you get your percentage, and then we got an estimate of total minutes on learning outcome. And we're going to try and get this data out. We're going to try and sort of estimate how much time is spent on climate change teaching. This is going to be an estimate, but we want this to be as accurate as possible. And then we want to look at what learning outcomes are covered in that teaching session. So teaching, and so if 1A is covered in that teaching session, so you would go onto this bit and say, right, well, that 1A was covered, and it was they were talking about natural resources in this lecture, and they had a slide on that, or part of a slide on that. And so you put that in, and then you don't put anything else in for the rest of these rows, and you put in a brief description of the of the slide, and I want you guys to put in the title, and the title is really important because it helps us again estimate how much time is spent taught on that topic, because if we've got multiple learning outcomes covered on the same slide, then we know we need to divide that by a certain amount. So we can call the slide resource availability, for example, and then you put that in inverted commas, and then you write a little spiel that says slides talks, or you go one time slide that talks about resource depletion and effects on health, something like that. Okay, and on here we've got all the different learning outcomes. So if you're looking through a lecture, you could be like, okay, well, which things have been covered here? I think there's some climate and sustainability relevant topics here. I'm going to go through all the learning outcomes, and they're all up here, all lined up. And if you think that they're relevant, then you can go down here and you can click on it. On the learning outcome 1, the broad learning outcome 1, we've sort of changed. We've put down different topics because we're trying to even get more granular data on these learning outcomes rather than they've just been covered or not. And you'll see there's a little drop down, but if you think that it's still covered in that learning outcome, but it's still, we haven't put the option there, you can put other. Just please state why you think it's relevant in the description at the end. And the important thing is with 1C, if 1C has been covered, so remember this was the climate, sort of the environmental risks to health, and we talked about the mechanisms and we talked about the health topics. So if a lecture slide is talking about, say, extreme heat and its impact on cardiovascular health, then you put in extreme heat here as a mechanism. So this is the mechanism. So detail the environmental mechanism discussed, and then the health topic discussed as well. And this is the only one where you put two. This is the only outcome or column where you put two different entries in. And then you would put in at the end here extreme heat, or whatever the title of the slide is, and you'd go and you go one time slide on extreme heat and impact on stroke, for instance, and then you could say also, and for instance, asthma. Not that I think there's a massive association there, but this is just an example. And so we've written here that extreme heat is our mechanism, and we've written cardiovascular here. So we need to add in another row on that same lecture slide, because it talks about extreme heat and respiratory health. So if we go extreme heat and respiratory, and if then we just still keep this as 1/56 because we've got one slide talking about extreme heat out of 56, and that same slide is talking about respiratory health. So what we can do then is just copy this down because we know that slide is talking about two different things, different mechanisms. So that's what the case is for these learning outcomes under the broad learning outcome of 1, or the broad 1 learning outcome. And then the other ones have just a basic yes, no. So the definition, are they defining the concept of environmental sustainability in a lecture slide? Yes, and then that's fine. And then you just, again, do the same thing. And all these other learning outcomes are just yes or blank options. So a bit simpler than these other ones. And the reason why we want to do this is because the learning outcome under 1 is more likely to be covered more in depth, we think, and these are slightly likely just to be covered in passing. And so it's important we know when they're covered. All right. So, any questions straight off the bat from that? If not, we'll go through an example and So to clarify, if a presentation covers multiple learning outcomes, we need to fill out a new row per learning outcome. I imagine you mean per LO. Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly that. So and even in the same slide, it might be covered. Seem really laborious, but the reason is because it's very difficult. Otherwise, it's very difficult to analyse the data and sort of get that estimate of the minutes taught. But we'll go through an example. If there aren't any more questions about that, I will go through the example. So, hopefully, you guys can see the presentation screen. If that works. So, example asthma lecture. So this is, I'm just using some slides we got off the internet, basically looking at asthma. And so you can imagine you've gone through your year one teaching materials, and you find this lecture on asthma, and you're like, oh, maybe actually I've gone through loads of crap, and there's no climate or sustainability content on that. But actually, I think this one, asthma is probably going to be included. Asthma is probably going to have some climate and sustainability relevant material on it. So you can look quite carefully through ones that you think are probably going to be relevant, and you see here that this lecture is talking about asthma triggers. So in this slide in particular is talking, saying asthma can be triggered by many airborne factors, so pollen, mold spores, air pollution. Okay, fine. So we're thinking, right, well, we need to put this into our spreadsheet, and there's a few things that are covered here. So we go onto our spreadsheet and we go, right, so we can delete this. And just delete this as well. And we can write, okay, so let's say we are from Bristol, and the title of the teaching session is asthma. And the course is an undergraduate course. And the year of study is, let's say it's the first year. And it's a lecture, and it's an hour long, and it has 50 slides. And we've got one slide here on asthma triggers. So we're going to go equals 1 divided by 50, because we've got 1 out of 50 slides that we think is relevant to a learning outcome. And we go through the learning outcomes, right? So outline the dependence on human health on global and local ecological systems which supply essentials such as air, water, and a stable climate. Now, does anyone think this is relevant? Does anyone think this one might be covered? Feel free to shout out. Right on the group. Hannah J, you are absolutely correct. So yes, you go 1A, yeah. So on air, perfect, top marks. So you go, right, air, yeah, that's covered. Air is, we're talking about our dependence on clean air, basically here. And we go, so we put that in there, and the rest of it gets blanked out. And then you go to here and you go, right, well, what was that lecture called? It was called asthma triggers. What was that lecture slide called? Sorry, was the title of that slide, asthma triggers. And you can talk about air pollution as a trigger for asthma. But are there any other learning outcomes that we might want to also include in this? So if we go through this and we look at these and we go, right, discuss the contribution of human activity and population size to global environmental changes, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion. Is that relevant in this one? Anyone hazard a guess? Just for the purposes of time, I'll say I don't think so, not really. It's not really covering that learning outcome. But if we get to 1C, are we thinking about that? So describe the mechanisms by which human health is affected by environmental change. So anyone think that this might be relevant? Or are we talking here about a mechanism by which the environmental change is impacting human health? Any ideas? Yes, question mark. Correct. Don't question yourself. Perfectly right. So air quality and pollution. You go down the list. go, yeah, air quality and pollution. They're talking about that as a mechanism for an impact on health. And you think, okay, well, and then what's the health topic being discussed? And we could say that that's, we scroll down. You can scroll down, up and down all of these. By the way, please download this as an Excel spreadsheet rather than using it as like a Google sheet or anything like that. The drop downs and the formulas won't work so well. So please download it as an Excel spreadsheet, especially when you come to do the data collection. Anyway, so you go down and you click, right, well, they've covered air pollution, air quality and pollution and respiratory health. And you go along to the end here and you can copy that down because it's the same lecture, it's the same topic, and both explain why you're covering that in that learning outcome. And you can copy this down as well because that's all the same because we're covering the same slide. Still 1 out of 56, 1 out of 50, sorry. And we've got all our other learning outcomes. We've got our learning outcomes down there. So what are the other learning outcomes? Does it cover any of these? Describe features of a health promoting local environment in a community and healthcare setting. Probably not. It's not really talking about health promoting local environment. Are they defining the concept of environmental sustainability? No, they don't do that. Do they explain how trends in demographics, technology and climate may affect our ability? No. So all of these, I think, are probably no. But as you get more and more used to the collecting data, you'll remember more and more of the learning outcomes and won't need to read exactly through them each time. So it'll become a lot slicker. But you go through and see, are any of these being covered? Identify ways to improve environmental sustainability for health systems? No. So none of that, and you just then leave that. So we've covered 2 in that. That slide's covered 2 different learning outcomes, and we've written that all correctly down there. All right, so that's just one slide, and we go on. So does exhaust really matter to people with asthma? And they talk about a study that examined the 1996 Summer Olympic Games, and they found that that when they stopped traffic, these changes resulted in marked declines in ozone and other air pollutants known to trigger asthma exacerbations. Okay, fine. So that's probably covering the same learning outcomes, isn't it? So we could say, right, well, this learning outcome is being covered again on the same lecture, asthma, but it's actually probably being covered in 2 slides. So we changed that 1 to 2 because they're still talking about clean air. They're still talking about air as an important factor for health. And we're going to just put, if you go on here and you press Alt, Enter, you can put a new row in. So Alt, Enter, and then you put the inverted commas in, and you write, does exhaust really matter to people with asthma? And you write one time slide, put one time slide on all these, one time slide on air pollution, and go one time slide on air pollution and asthma, what's it talk about? Asthma exacerbations. And you know what, actually it's the same for both of those, so you can copy that down and that's all fine. And you can say, oh, well, this has been covered in two slides as well, so we can go to so that's fine. Okay. And then we talk about this one, we look at this one. So results for people with asthma when compared to the pre-Olympic data, the frequency of asthma events decreased by this much. So reducing pollutants and ozone reduced the asthma burden of asthma. So we could put that again in that same thing. And we can say they're not really talking about in this one, clean air is the dependence of human health, but they are still talking about air quality and pollution in respect to respiratory health. So we could say, okay, well that's actually covered in 3 slides, and we'll put the other title in the end here. And I won't bother writing it in, but you just double click here and press Alt Enter and put in speech marks. Results to people with asthma. One time slide showing results of reduced ozone on asthma exacerbations. There we go. So that's kind of how you collect the data. So we didn't cover any of these ones, but these are, as I just said, these are just a simple yes or blank option. So I'm going to give you guys, so now if you guys go onto that box site and download the example lecture, so there's a PowerPoint there, which is called sort of global, it's called like an example lecture, or let me just check what it's called. So I'll just go onto the chat here. Why not let someone in? So there were two separate slides in the lecture talking about different cause and effect, e.g. cardiac and extreme heat and asthma and air pollution. We still put it down as one single percentage. So if you've got that, you just put another row in and put, so if that was the case, so you put again here, say if that slide was covering air pollution and cardiac issues, you put air pollution, cardiac, and it's still, they still would all be the same because it's the same lecture, but you would just cover it, say that was just covered in one slide, you would just put one here because say one slide was covering both of them, both topics, and it was the same slide here. You could copy this and say, right, well, results for people with asthma, whatever the slide was called, and you could write and cardiovascular health. Does that answer your question? So the reason why
we've lost your audio, James.
Oh no.
Oh, you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Oh no. Okay. So so did you guys get that? Did you guys get that last bit? Did that make sense?
Could you just say it again, please?
Yeah, sure. So if you get a slide, for instance, that talks about, say you've got a slide that talks about air quality and pollution, and it talks about respiratory health and cardiovascular health. Yeah. So you put two different rows for that down, and as part of that, you would then, so you'd have these two different rows, and you'd have, so if it was one slide covering cardiovascular health and it was the same slide covering cardiovascular and respiratory, you would put in here at the end, so say that last slide that we looked at, does exhaust really matter to people with asthma? And so let's say, just for argument's sake, it talks about asthma and also cardiovascular health. You would put that title there and just explain why it's covering both asthma exacerbations and cardiovascular health. And then you'd have a different row. And the reason it's really important to have the title here is so when we go through and analyze it, we can split up these percentages and just estimate how much of that time was spent on each sort of learning outcome, or each sort of part of that learning outcome. Does that make sense? Someone's got a hand up. So if you guys go onto that box site, does that make sense? Or do you, it's fine if it needs a bit more explanation. I'm really happy to explain it. It's really important that you guys understand this clearly. The crux is every learning outcome just gets another row. But if the same learning outcome is covered in the same lecture, then you can add to it, basically. So it just saves you adding row upon row. Yeah, that makes sense. Great stuff. Thanks, Laura. Great. So if you guys could go onto this box site here that I've just, if you guys scroll up and see where I've posted this book, you've already opened the box site, hopefully. You go on here and download the example lecture, which should be a lecture on global health. The name's just escaped me. So yeah, go on to open the example lecture, open the data collection template empty, and try it for yourself. So I'll give you guys a bit of information on what the spreadsheet is. So open up the empty template and open up the lecture. And I'm going to give you guys about 15 minutes to go through this. And it's a bit of a hard one, so don't feel that most lectures will have very little or no climate and sustainability relevant content in it. So, but this has a lot. So it's just really to get you guys used to just understanding which learning outcomes are covered by sort of what kind of slides, and to understand how to use the template. So just like a bit of practice basically, but don't worry because it is a bit tricky. Throughout the whole process of this audit, I really want you guys to ask questions to your regional leads. They're going to create WhatsApp groups for you guys, so you can just ask questions just to make sure you're on the right track, or just to make sure you're doing things right. So open up that PowerPoint and have a go. These are the details so that you need to put in. So we're going to say it's Southampton University. We're going to say it was an undergraduate course. We're going to say it was year 1, 60 minutes long, and there was total size 56. So open that all up. Have a go going through it. You won't get to the end of it because it'll take a bit of time because there's so much detail in there. And any questions, so if anything's not clear, ping a message and I'll try and answer it. And so this is the sort of flow diagram. I'll leave this up for the time being so you guys can see sort of what the ideas are. So it says 2019 to 2020. Please ignore that. We're going to be looking at the 2020 to 2021 years. But you can go through this. Flow diagram, and hopefully it directs you as how to fill in that spreadsheet, the template. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I will let you guys get on with that for 15 minutes, and then we'll go through. Has everyone managed to download the 2 things? If you haven't, please let me know. Just to clarify, if there are multiple slides, so thanks for the question, Poppy, that's great. Just to clarify, if there are multiple slides addressing the same LO, we record this in 1 row only. Yeah. If a slide is just stating the LO, probably not. I think there'll probably be more content later. I wouldn't include that. If it's just a title slide, don't bother including it. It needs to have the content in it. And the thing here is, don't try and read too much into what might have been said or what might have been taught. Just try and go off what is on the slides and what's covered. What's covered there. because it can be a bit difficult to then try and interpret what was said at those sessions. Should we include slides which have diagrams about one of the LOs? Yeah, if you think it's relevant, then you can include it. Yeah, because if it's you could infer that a lecturer talking about maybe population increases might be like if it's a graph on that or a graph on air pollution, then you can infer quite reliably. As I said, where I said don't infer too much, but if it's very clear that that's what they're talking about, looking at a map of air pollution, then you can reliably say that they're talking about air pollution in that. Okay. I'll I'll give you guys a couple more minutes. Hopefully not pulling your hair out. Hopefully it's relatively self-explanatory. Feel free to ask questions, but we'll go through sort of what I thought were the model answers. There are some. We've tried to make it as objective as possible throughout this process, but there is some subjectivity to it. So don't worry if it's not exactly the same. What we're trying to just get at is as accurate estimates as possible. Teaching may vary across academies and clinical years, with some academics address some of these others. How do you suggest collecting data on this with the potential differences in teaching in mind? Probably, I'm not quite sure. So how would we? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is it the idea that some things might be taught completely differently than others, but they're still sort of teaching the same learning outcome? They don't need to replicate what I've told you guys at all, but it's just you've got to infer from the wording from that learning outcome and just try and understand what that lecturer was trying to get at. And if you feel that lecture or those slides or that teaching session have covered that that learning outcome, then you can say it's a yes, or you can put the category underneath it. Does that make sense? Great. So should we go through things? How do you guys all find it? What do we do if the session length is not specified? So I'd recommend going through the you'll probably be able to get access to the timetables, your lecture timetables for all the years. And when we give you the draft request to get access to all your years information, we're going to ask for that timetable information. So you can hopefully link that teaching event with the timetable session. The other thing to mention is we're only looking at the core curriculum here. We're only looking at the lectures that everyone needs to go to. We're not looking at student selected units or elective units or anything else. We're just looking at things that everyone gets access to. Do we have to do all lectures from all years? Yeah, so we are asking you to do that. So years 1 to 5. It might seem like an overwhelming task, but our experience is that this takes about 3 days of time. And for the most part, you'll be able to skip through lectures pretty quickly because most of them won't have any climate or sustainability content at all. But you can just flick through the slides. But we do ask that you flick through them, but you can be, in some areas, you can be a bit more thorough and others a bit less, because some things won't. Our lectures are currently all recorded and not on a timetable. That's okay. But if they're recorded, presumably they'll have the timing on. If not, then your best estimate. If you think it's an hour lecture or a 2-hour lecture, then we'll just have to go with that. We'll just have to go with your best guess. Hopefully that's all right. Okay, so how did you all get on? Does anyone want to shout out, tell me how they felt about it? I'm a pretty friendly guy. You can't really get it wrong. It'd be good to get your feedback. Anyone find it really tricky, or thought it was okay, or wants to know a bit more? Okay, all right, I'll keep going then. We might run about 5 to 10 minutes over. I'm really sorry about that, but this is really important that you guys get this right. So we'll go through this. We'll go through the lecture, and we'll go through the sort of example. What I've written is sort of what I think are the answers. Again, it is down to interpretation. So it's just your best inference from what you've seen here. So, Global Health Part 1 is the lecture title. So in here, we're going to put the University, Southampton. We're going to put Global Health Part 1 as part of the undergraduate course, as I put up at the beginning there. It's the year of study, it's the first year of study as a lecture. Let's say it was 60 minutes long. Okay, and we're going to go through it. So global health lectures are probably one of the ones you want to look out closely for, because they're most likely to have climate and sustainability content, relevant content in them. So the objectives of this are to show the variation in health, and we can see actually here that they're going to talk about planetary health. So we can think, okay, right, I should probably go through this quite closely because there's going to be some aspects of this that I need to talk about. I need to put into the audit. So globalization, what is it? There's nothing really specific to climate and sustainability in here, so here we can move on. Populations, there was one sort of non-sustainability related topic which was talking about demographics. So we're thinking about population rise and how that might affect healthcare, and we've got a slide here. So human population growth chart. And it shows this little chart of the human population. So you can say, okay, right, well, I think that's probably, it's a global health lecture. They're talking about population rise, and we've got a learning outcome on that. But which one is it? And so you go through these things, and you can look up here on the top here rather than reading it down here or whatever you like. And you go through, like we did in that thing, and go, right, it's not doing any of those, I don't think, but it is talking about how trends in demographics may affect our ability to provide healthcare in the future. So we can probably put a yes there, and we can go, right, well, we've got human population. So sorry, I've actually put this in twice. That's a mistake there. Apologies. I saved that wrong. So there we go. So we've got that there, and we've got human population growth chart and graphic on population growth. So we're saying, right, we've got one slide that's covering that at the moment. So this would be 1 at that time. So 1 there, it'd be 1 out of 56. And then you keep going through, and this population size by place. I don't think that's necessary to talk about population growth, but it's just the size. So probably wouldn't include that. And you might think about including this one. Oh, sorry, I've put in population size by place. So you can see how this can be quite subjective, especially on some of these more broader learning outcomes. But population size by place, I've decided that was talking about population growth and a graphic, and then I've also included population growth. So this other slide talking about where populations are going to grow, and I've decided that's all relevant to this learning outcome here. And so there's 3 slides covering that I've decided there, and we're going to go 3 there. And we're going to put in the 3 different slide titles here and talk about why this is small justification on why that is relevant. Okay, so we've got 3 slides on that learning outcome. All right. And yeah, so when we go through and we think, okay, fine, so this is all right. Have I included any of this? So we're going through here. None of this sort of related to sustainability or climate change. You wouldn't think this is all sort of not really talking about climate or sustainability, but we can keep going through. And we go, oh, there's a title actually here, a few global issues, so social inequity, planetary health, water. Okay, so they're probably going to start talking about planetary health and things. And this slide didn't talk about it does talk about perhaps the social environment, but not the actual environment. This slide here, one could argue, talks about the environmental conditions, but we're not, and you could think that relates to learning outcome 1, but they're not really talking about a sort of psychosocial environmental model here. This is sort of a more sort of standard model of contributors to health. So probably not going to add that. Talk about inequality, probably not relevant here. So being poor in a poor country. Okay, and we read through this and we talk about, oh, there's food and water insecurity. There's not necessarily that's not specifically relevant to climate change, but what here is relevant is talking about vulnerability to climate change. So being poor in a poor country increases your vulnerability to climate change. Right, so that seems pretty relevant. And so remember learning outcome 3 is sort of talking about the ethics around it, and 3A is explain how the health impacts of environmental change are distributed unequally within populations and the disparity between those most responsible and those affected by change. And so you could argue here that being poor in a poor country, that slide talks about how poorer people are more vulnerable to climate events. And so you're going to put in here the same details as above, and here you're going to say, well, we've only got one slide covering that at the moment, so it'd be 1 divided by 56. You put in a yes there, and then you put this slide title on here. So being poor in a poor country, slide includes a point including that poorer countries are more vulnerable to climate change. Fine, fair enough, cool. Okay, and then you go through, and there's a slide on indoor air pollution, and so we go right, and I've said that shows a preponderance to poorer countries, and so it looks like the lecturer is getting at the idea that indoor air pollution affects poorer nations further. So you can say, well, that slide's also covering that topic. So you put a 2 in here. Because you think it's covering that, and then you go through and you're like, well, it's probably also covering 1A because we're talking about the dependence on human health on air, and so you go to that. All right, and then we've got some slides on the ecosystem model of health. So they are talking about the ecosystem model of health here. Which is this exact diagram I showed you, and they're talking specifically about climate stability, biodiversity, and natural resources dictate trends in global health. So that's exactly kind of what I was talking about in terms of that 1A learning outcome. And so I've put that in here. So we've got a stable climate, it's obviously covered by that slide. We've got a slide saying an ecosystem model of health, including climate stability, biodiversity, and natural resources as a key dictator for global health. And if you can see here, I've put that in 3 times because it's covered 3 different topics. So air, stable climate, and natural resources, and I've put a slide in for each one of those. And then hopefully that explains a bit about how hopefully you can judge your own efforts against what I've done there and see what you think, see if it makes sense or if it doesn't make sense. And then, so what I'd recommend doing is going through this. If you have time, just have a look through this and have a look through my model answers, see if you agree. If you don't agree, that's fine. If you think that your answers are the right ones, then that's fine. Because there is some subjectivity to this, as I said, but we're trying to make it as objective as possible. So when you're going through these slides, go through the flow chart. Is it really related to climate change and sustainability, and is which learning outcomes are being covered by that slide or that session? So this filled out template is on the box, so you can go and find that and see where you think. See how we compared with each other. And I've gone through and done that whole lecture, but I won't go through every aspect and talk about it. But I will just so you can go through and see what you think, see if we agree. But I'll just talk about 1C. So here we talk about child health and climate change. We talk about drought, heat stress, flooding, air pollution, infectious disease as a result of environmental change and how that's affected pediatrics. And so an example here of where 1C is relevant is they're talking about climate change, changes in vector ecology, and also, no, sorry, that was this slide here, where they're talking about changing vector ecology and infectious disease, but on this one where they're talking about pediatric health, you can see here that I've put in floods and storms, extreme heat as mechanisms, and then pediatrics as the health topic. Right, so I will stop there and see if you guys have any questions. Any questions at all? If there's not been teaching but required reading for tutorials on a topic, for example, do we include that on the spreadsheet? I think we're not going to include, it depends it depends if what's covered in the tutorials. So if they talk about these topics in the tutorials, and that's an aspect of the tutorial, then you can include it. But if it's just additional reading, you know, at the end of a lecture where they say additional resources and things like that, then I think it's probably best, then it's best to leave that, because we want to capture what everyone is being taught, basically. Is everyone required to do this reading? And if so, what learning outcomes are covered in that? And you can quickly breeze through that reading. Don't please read through it all, and you just need to get what's covered and basically go through. If that tutorial has any other resources, just see what's covered in that. Yeah. So if you can have a quick look through the reading materials or maybe the learning outcomes for that tutorial and see if they match any of the learning outcomes here. And you can divide that tutorial as a teaching session in terms of percentage by, say, if in lectures we're looking at slides, if one learning outcome or one bit of the resources that you think is about a third of the resources, for example, you could say 30% of that, 30% of this teaching session was about this LO. Does that make sense? Yeah, exactly. Just get a gist of what was covered and try and just do your best bet as to what you think, how much of that you think was covered. So at Southampton, we had a lot of peer-to-peer teaching, and that was sort of dictated by learning outcomes. And so the way I'd go through that is look through the learning outcomes, see the resources provided, see if any of those look like they're relevant to climate sustainability, have a quick breeze through, and then see how much of that teaching session. So we would have like an hour and a half teaching session. And then I'd be like, well, maybe that learning outcome, if that learning outcome is really related to climate and sustainability, and there are 13 learning outcomes, I would say, well, 1 divided by 13 times the lecture or the teaching session length was covering these learning outcomes. Does that make sense? Lydia, hopefully that's made sense. Yeah, great. It's really, and like basically if you have any questions at all during the time and you're stuck and you don't really know what to do, I'm really asking you guys to not struggle away, because one, it doesn't help you because you're not quite know what to do, and just ask the regional lead. And if they don't know, they'll ask me or part of one of the other teams. But what we really want is good quality data. So it's really important to try and get the estimates as accurate as possible. And if you're struggling to know what to put down, then just ask your regional lead on that WhatsApp group that they'll set you up on, and they can give you some help. And if they don't know, they'll ask me or one of the other lead authors. Does that make sense? Hopefully that's all right. Any other questions about how to fill in the spreadsheet? Now's your time to just try and understand a bit, but you can always ask questions as you go along, as I said. Okay, great. And so please just have a look through my model answers. You might disagree with them, and that's fine. We know that the two auditors aren't going to have exactly matching data sets. What we're going to be looking through is what learning outcomes are covered, and if there's a pretty broad brush similarity match. If they're wildly different, then we might ask a third auditor to come in, or we might just have a look at the two data sets. But we're hoping they'll all match. We might ask you guys to just go away and talk amongst yourselves to just really sort out what's going on, why there's a big difference. Because it might just be that one of you doesn't understand how the lectures work or how the teaching sessions work. Oh, please could you send the example spreadsheet in the chat? Can't see it in the box link. Okay, sorry, yeah, I'll put it on the box link this evening. A more general question: how will all the final data be presented? So we're going to look at what learning outcomes are cut. We're going to look in general what learning outcomes are covered by UK medical schools, and we're going to look at more granular detail. So like how much of like say respiratory, how much is taught on respiratory health versus cardiovascular health, and see if that matches up against sort of the actual risks that climate change poses. Are they talking about waste but not about anaesthetic gases in sustainability and things like that? So we just want to kind of understand what people are talking about. We're going to probably do a crude analysis looking at like the average coverage, and then look at sort of the spread of what's covered, and then look at like how much time is spent on each learning outcome, and where perhaps we as a country needs to be spending more time, and also where individual medical schools need to spend more time. Thank you. The question, what does it mean? Okay, more so that's a more general question. Thank you, explained really well. A question with the flow diagram. What does it mean by the section about if it specifically states environmental topics? May have misread. So is the content, so in our pilot study, which we did with Southampton, George's and Bristol, not George's, with Imperial and Bristol, we found that there was a bit of confusion around what really counts. Because sometimes people thought antibiotic resistance counted because it's like a global health topic, or they're mentioning like lead in the water, in like as a toxic exposure or whatever. But what we really want to get at the crux of is the lecture talking, or is that lecture slide talking about climate change, environmental damage, or sustainability specifically? So just ask yourself that question: is this slide really getting at that, the idea of sort of environmental degradation, rather than just sort of generic environmental health? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so then there will be a final report. Yeah, so we're aiming to publish this in sort of end of this year. And hopefully that will be successful, and you guys will get collaborator status on that publication. Which you can put on your CVs and things like that. Any other questions? It's great to ask questions because then it's clearer for you guys. If not, I'll talk about the next steps. So the next steps, so we're going to send you guys out an email that will also probably come out to you guys this weekend, which will contain a draft data request for your university. So we'll be sending out a request that you guys send to your faculty, and whoever you think is the most appropriate. So whether that's an admin person who can give you access to Blackboard, or a more senior person in the faculty who can give you access to year 1 to 6 or year 1 to 5 courses, and so you can go through systematically and just go year by year, topic by topic, lecture by lecture to look through the slides. We'll give you the content in that email. We'll give you the contact details for the other auditor at your university, so you can both together get that data access. This can be a bit of a tricky. This can be a bit of a hurdle, this step, and so we really ask you guys to try quite hard. You might need to call people, you might need to email, just to get access to the materials, but most medical schools, we think, will be pretty open to you accessing that stuff. So yeah, you've got to try a bit hard and might have to do a bit of digging, but we'll provide you with that draft data request. As a pair, you'll request access to all the so in the email, we'll give you a draft data request, we'll give you the contact details for the other auditor, and we'll give you links to the useful materials. So we'll send that box link again and the data collection template. And as a pair, we're going to ask you to request access to all the 2020 to 2021 learning materials. So that's years 1 to 5 in the year 2020 to 2021. So we're not looking at a single cohort here, we're looking at a snapshot of your medical school's teaching. And then individually, we want you guys to use the data collection tool, so after you've requested the data, you're going to individually use that data collection tool to complete the audit, go through all the lectures and stuff. And we ask you not to confer with the other auditor during this period, just so we've just got a better, so we're hoping that having 2 auditors will lead to a better, more accurate data set. And if you have any questions at all, ask your regional lead, they'll be super happy to help. And then you send that data collection tool back to us by August the 1st. Earlier the better, really. If you can get it back to us earlier, then we can analyze it, and then we'll get back to you guys in the following week or so. And this deadline may be pushed back depending on the author's clinical commitments. So we need to be a bit. We need to be a bit open with that, but we'll but if you guys send us the data by the 1st of August, we will have a look at the spreadsheets and do a similarity check. If they're similar enough to each other, then we'll ask you guys to create a final collaborative data sheet with the other auditor. So ask you guys to work together to create a final spreadsheet that we can use to analyse. And it might be that there's some differences in there, and you guys just need to talk them through and really see which one, what's the most accurate data. Because some of you might have like collected things that others wouldn't, the other haven't, or you might have noticed, or you might have a bit more information about the course, things like that. So yes, so that's the next step. If the slide is ambiguous, would you recommend listening to the audio, or are we looking at pure written content? If you can listen to the audio, that's great. We're aware that we don't want this to be like too laborious for you guys. So if you think that it's really relevant and you're like not quite sure, then listen to the audio content and put that on the description. Say, listen to audio content, this contains this. But we're really good looking at the slides mainly. We know that that's not the best measure, but otherwise it's going to be you guys looking through thousands of hours of lectures, which we don't want you guys to do. We want this to be relatively efficient. If our so it's not looking at pure written content, you might have to infer a little bit. But all within the realms. Don't try and infer way beyond what the slide is saying. So don't try and get into the lecturer's head. But if it seems reasonable that that learning outcome is covered, then we'll rely on your reason. If our uni has 2 courses, e.g. undergrad and graduate, are both auditors covering both? Yes, please. Again, as part of our pilot, this was in where the finding was that it took 3 days to do both graduate and undergraduate. If you're a bit unsure about how the graduate or undergraduate is taught, we really hope that you might be able to get in touch with like a grad or an undergrad and just check how things were taught. Even better if the other auditor is a graduate and you're an undergraduate, then you can just ask like what's the layout of the course and try and get a bit of an understanding there. But yeah, we're asking you to cover both. We found that in most courses, actually the courses merge at some point, so it won't be double the work. It might just be a bit different in the first 2 years. Does that make sense? Yes, great. Okay, fine. So those are the next steps. Any questions? Any questions at all? Again, thank you guys so much for being part of this. We really think this and a few other interventions such as planetary health report card and some other things that are coming out soon may well change the landscape of medical teaching in the UK. And we're hoping that we're going to produce a generation of doctors that are both prepared for the challenges that climate change pose to global health, but also doctors that are going to practice more sustainably, and you guys are absolutely instrumental part of that, and I'm so glad that there are so many of you guys who are so interested in this topic to take part in this audit. We really hope it's going to instigate change, and I'll stay on the line for a few more minutes to see if anyone's got any questions, but just await an email from us in the next few days, in the next week or so, and we'll go from there.
Hi, James. I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So our course is like mainly PBL.
Okay.
So I've got a couple of questions that kind of stem from that. One, I'm kind of predicting that staff might be hesitant to give access to like the content that I haven't covered yet because of the nature of the course. It's not like secretive, but basically you're not really meant to know what's coming down the line because it will give away what like sort of the PBL cases are every week. So I'm a little bit concerned about pushback. Okay.
We'll have to see how it goes. I think I understand what you're saying. I can't think they'd be too upset about you going. It might just be the fact that is your problem-based learning, is it learning outcome based? Yeah. So it might be that you don't ask for the problem-based, like the scenarios themselves, but you just ask for the learning outcomes and the resources that go with them. So you're just getting the learning outcomes and the resources rather than the actual case itself. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you can ask for that. I'm aware that there's going to be hurdles with accessing the data, but there are studies, similar studies to this done before, where they've got access to the data. So hopefully they'll see that there's a greater cause. They may well just not release the stuff for you, and it might just be that you have to ask really nicely to get that access.
Yeah. Okay.
We understand if you can't get that, and if that's the case, then we'll just have to like exclude that part of the course, or just put like a asterisk on that. But I can't think they'd be too adverse to you getting the learning outcomes and the resources.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And then obviously based on the learning outcomes, when I found like this year, just because a learning outcome is listed for a PBL case doesn't necessarily mean that there was ever any actual teaching on it. So a lot of our, well, I don't want to call it teaching, but we're meant to do self-directed learning, and then we just recap that as a group. But there's no taught content on it. We're just expected to cover that learning area on our own. So that's, I guess, my second question. I'm assuming that can't really be incorporated.
So I think it's just sort of down to what you think is sort of the most appropriate thing to write down. If a learning outcome is part of like the examinable topics, and they've provided resources that are clearly related to climate and sustainability and a learning outcome, like one of the GMC learning outcomes, one of the ones auditing, then I think it'd be reasonable to say, yeah, this was covered, or they were at least expecting students to cover this. So it's not necessarily like completely, it doesn't have to be like didactical teaching. It's just, are the med schools trying to get everyone to learn about this? And so it might not be like, we'd include that in the teaching session. It's I appreciate what you're saying, it's very hard to sometimes know, but we've just got to try and be as reasonable as possible. And if they put a big emphasis on that, or like a whole learning outcome is about, climate and sustainability, and they provide loads of resources on it, you could infer from that you were supposed to cover it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess I'm wondering how that'll get categorized in terms of the spreadsheet, because generally, so we only get given the learning outcomes for our PBL cases at the end, like when we finish the PBL case. And then it basically just sums up like what you should have covered during the week. And there have been many occasions where I've looked at the list and gone, shit, I've not even done half of that. They don't provide us with the resources. We're just kind of expected to almost fill in the gaps between what the case is and what they're expecting us to learn. If a lot of what we're meant to cover is not given like in lectures.
Yeah, that is. I've got to say, I didn't realise. I thought that most med schools give the learning outcomes before, so you've got at least a little skeleton of what to.
No, you have to guess.
Which medical school are you at?
Nottingham.
Okay. So I think you'll have to. I think it's going to be. I can see why you're now worried that it might be an issue with getting the learning outcomes.
Yeah, sorry, I just put the camera on because you're speaking to nobody, but
that's right.
Yeah, that's why, I kind of I just wasn't really sure how it was going to fit in, frankly. It's one thing to go like, yeah, we have lectures, and those have learning kind of outcomes, and all of them will have slides I can go through, no problem. But considering a large chunk of the course is PBL and is self-directed, it's a challenge.
So I think the solution there would be try and see if you can get access to the learning outcomes. If you can get access, then they're obviously wanting you guys to cover that, and they're providing the resources even after that sort of session. So the idea would be that even though they're not covering it specifically, they have said we want you after it. They have said you need to cover this, which would kind of come under like topics they're teaching being sort of a broad term, but they're expecting you to learn that, and that is their kind of teaching on that. So if you do get access to the learning outcomes afterwards, then you can a release, then you can say, right, well, these were these were relevant and these were this much of these were supposed to take up this much of the PBL, or whatever your best guess is.
Okay.
If you don't get access to the learning outcome, is this the graduate or undergraduate or both?
Grad.
The grad course.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if that's the case and we're really struggling, then we'll just like we're struggling with data, we'll just have to leave out like the grad course or whatever and put an asterisk. But what I would ask is like try the best, because we don't want to leave out a university just because of the way things are taught. Southampton sounds quite similar, but we got given the learning outcomes. We got access to all the learning outcomes before, which I think seems a lot more reasonable. I've got to say.
Yeah, well, you'd think, but literally at the start of every PBL week, we get given the case prompt, which is very brief, and then the aim is basically to talk amongst ourselves, have a guess about what we think the case is covering, and then we have to come up with the learning areas ourselves. And at most, we maybe, if we're really off track, the facilitator might give you some prompts, but you don't see the learning outcomes until you get to the very end of the case.
Okay.
I don't know why they do it that way. That's a whole nother question.
And what year are you? Year.
So I've just finished year one, so we've only got 6 months.
So you've still got a year left of that, probably.
Six months, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what so you'll be able to do year one and maybe a bit, and then just maybe ask if you can get access. If you can't, that's fine. We'll just have to leave it out. All studies have missing data, and that's just part and parcel of it. Hopefully, you can get access to the undergraduate course, and we'll just say that we'll maybe if it's a problem across the board, we'll have to say that it was actually really difficult to understand what was being taught in problem-based learning, but this is our best estimate. But basically, if they give you the learning outcomes, then I think you can infer from presumably they give you some resources as well afterwards. No. Okay. Well, if the learning outcome covers like that area, and you think it's like specific enough that it would be reasonable for a student to go away and learn about that, then that's then that would be like covered. But like any issues, as you go along, if you're finding it a bit conceptually difficult, let your regional lead know, and then they'll let me know, or they'll be able to sort of figure it all out, hopefully. And if we have real struggles, then we'll just have to sort of park the PBL stuff. But I'm really hesitant to do that because I don't want to leave universities out.
Yeah, no, me too. That was why I just thought, better to talk it through and try and figure out how we might need to, to cover it or categorize it if need be. But yeah, I guess we'll see how it goes.
Good stuff.
Cheers.
Right, thanks very much. Maxine, did you have a question at all? Maybe not. Okay, I think you guys are the only two left. So thanks very much for joining, and just please await that email from us. And we'll see you. Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I think I was muted.
Oh, that's right.
My computer is a bit slow. So I was just actually listening to this as well because I'm in year 2 and I've also got PBL. But as opposed to him, I do get the learning objectives beforehand, so that was quite good to know. I just have like a really, really basic question. I think my uni really only does an undergraduate course, so
okay.
Meaning that everyone starts at year 1.
Yeah. We
divide it into preclinical and clinical, meaning that I would have to categorize everything as an undergraduate, right?
Yeah, so if it's just an undergraduate, so graduate course meaning like you have to be in. So Southampton, we've got 2 courses. One for you go in when you're 18, or you can have another degree, or we've got a separate graduate course that's only available to people who have already done a university degree.
Okay, yeah.
Which is usually accelerated. So what university are you? Ooh.